Canto 6 attempts to work out a generalization on the theme of untimely death. Death is not uncommon. Even if one person dies, others remain. The poet's point is that the fact that death is not uncommon does not make it any less bitter. The poet now attempts to give concrete exemplifications. The father, proud of his gallant son, suddenly finds his gallant son dead by a shot. The mother, praying for her sailor son, unexpectedly discovers that her sailor son has dropped into his vast and wandering grave. The poet adds a personal touch to the narration by pointing out that he wrote what he wrote to please his friend, to please Halam. The maiden, waiting for her lover, suddenly comes to know that her lover, that her future husband is no more. Death, this death could have come in any guise, such as death by drowning while crossing a ford, or death resulting from the fall from a horse. What is the net result of all this? The maiden loses her lover. The maiden loses her future husband and is condemned to perpetual maidenhood. And the speaker is unable to get a second friend. Let me quote the lines. To her perpetual maidenhood, and unto me no second friend. Indian students of In Memoriam A.H.H are here reminded of the famous story of Kisa Gautami. Kisa Gautami was the wife of a rich merchant. Her son, her only child, suddenly breathed his last. Kisa Gautami carried the body of her child from neighbor to neighbor, seeking the revival of the dead child. Finally, an old man advised Kisa Gautami to meet the Buddha. The Buddha said that he could bring the child back to life using a magic medicine which could be prepared only with white mustard seeds collected from a household where no one had died. Kisa Gautami went from house to house, but in every house she was informed that many persons had died. She realized that it was impossible for her impossible for her to collect white mustard seeds from a household where no one had died, because there was no such household. Kisa Gautami realized that death is universal. She became reconciled to her loss, and she took her first step in her spiritual journey towards enlightenment. I would like to observe here the contrast between the Eastern, the Indian attitude to death, approach to death, as conveyed through the narrative of Kisa Gautami, which is an attitude of absolute reconciliation, which is an attitude of unconditional acceptance, which is an attitude of unquestioning realization of the inevitability of death. And the Western attitude, the Anglo-Saxon attitude or the Anglo-Saxon approach towards death, which is never one of complete acceptance, complete reconciliation, as conveyed through Canto 6 of In Memoriam A.H.H. There is no doubt that while writing the lines about the young woman waiting for her lover, Tennyson had his own sister Emily in mind. The 18-year-old Emily Tennyson was engaged to Arthur Henry Halam, and it is certain that the picture of Emily, the young, beautiful Emily, can be found in the lines: meek, unconscious stuff, that sittest ranging golden hair, and glad to find thyself so fair, poor child. We now come to a very remarkable canto, Canto 7, whose thematic focus is the house of Halam. Halam is no longer there. The poet goes to Halam's house, and Halam's house, which had once been bright with love, is now described as dark house. And the street on which the house stands, which must have been at one time, which must have been in the good old days, beautiful, is now described as the long, unlovely street. The poet does not enter the house. There is no point because Halam is no longer there. The poet comes away. I would like to work out a comparison between this canto of In Memoriam A.H.H and the listeners of Walter de la Mare, which is looked upon as one of the most romantic poems in the English language. In the listeners, the traveller goes to a house which appears to stand in the middle of a forest, knocks at the door repeatedly, knocks at the door of the house repeatedly, but There is no response. The door does not open, and the traveler goes away. In Canto 7, we find Tennyson at his best. And it is passages like this which prompted T.S. Eliot to praise Alfred Lord Tennyson for the concentrated force of his poetry. Last answer of Canto 7, the poet establishes a contrast between the death of Halam and the life of the world. As the day begins, the life of the world begins. Halam may be dead and gone, but that does not put an end to the life of the world. There is a contrast between the death of Halam on the one hand and the life of the world which begins anew on the other, which begins again on the other. We are also told of the drizzling rain and the blank day. Again, a contrast between Halam's death and nature. The death of an individual does not affect the rhythms of nature, which go on and on and on. I am again compelled to quote from the brook of Tennyson. Men may come and men may go, but I go on forever. Canto 8 is a sort of amplification on Canto 7. In Canto 7, the speaker goes to Halam's house. Halam is not there. The speaker returns, finding the house, declaring that the house is, finding the house to be dark. In Canto 8, the mental state of the speaker is expressed through the mental state of a lover who goes to his beloved's house in high spirits, hoping to meet his beloved, and then comes to know that his beloved is not there. She is gone and she is far from home. Suddenly everything becomes dark. The poet says that all the places where he used to meet Halam, all those spots where he used to interact with Halam, have become dark. The field, the chamber, and the street, for all is dark where thou art not. The lover finds a flower beaten by rain and wind, which had been cared for by his woman. He decides to plant it. The speaker decides to plant the flower. The poet decides to plant a flower on the tomb of his friend so that it would please the eye of the dead man. The flower is the poetry of the poet. The flower is the poesy of the speaker. The flower may bloom there, in which case it's a very good thing. It's a very good thing because it's the tomb of his friend. Or at least it may die there, in which case also it is good because it dies at the tomb of his friend. I've already said that there is a homoerotic element in the relationship between speaker and subject in Memoriam A.H.H. And the fact that in the present canto, the poet unabashedly, openly without even the slightest embarrassment, works out a conjunction between his relationship with Halam on the one hand and the relationship between a lover and his beloved on the other, only confirms that there is indeed a homoerotic element in the relationship between the poet and his friend, in the relationship which is the foundation for the work. Canto 9 inaugurates the group of cantos which deals with the bringing of Halam's body from the continent to England. The poet calls the ship bringing the remains of Halam from Italy, from Italian shores to England, fair. He hopes that the winds will blow gently and will not ruffle the sails of the ship, that the stars will act as beacons, and that the ship carrying the body of Halam will have a safe and comfortable voyage. In the last stanza of the canto, the poet admits that he does not hope to see Halam, my Arthur, as he calls Halam, except at the end of his life, except on doomsday, on the day of judgment. My Arthur, whom I shall not see till all my widowed race be run. There is no possibility, there is no hope for the poet to see his beloved friend except on the day of judgment. This is a concept common to the Abrahamic religions. The Bible makes it clear that on doomsday, on the day of judgment, there will be the second coming of Christ. The graves will open and each man will have to face his destiny, and the kingdom of God and the kingdom of heaven will be established on earth. I would like to observe that the use of the term widowed race, the life of the poet after the death of Halam is my widowed race, only serves to emphasize the homoerotic element in the relationship between the two friends and in the poem. In the 10th canto, the poet visualizes the ship carrying the body of Halam coming to England. The ship moves towards English shores, and the poet can hear the sound of the keel, the noise of the keel of the ship. He can hear the sound of the bell of the ship. He can see the light in the cabin. He can see the sailor himself at the wheel. The speaker explains that it's not merely the mortal remains of Halam that are brought or that is brought by the ship. The ship brings the sailor to his wife. The ship brings international travelers back home. The ship brings letters from foreign lands. And of course, the ship brings thy dark freight, a vanished life. As the canto moves towards its close, the poet expresses the idea that It is better, or at least that is what we imagine, it is better to be buried in the open churchyard, taking the sunshine and the rains, near the church where the villagers celebrate Eucharist, than to be buried in the sea, in the salt water of the sea, in the midst of seaweeds and shells. It has been pointed out by critic after critic that the fundamental reason for the amazing success of Tennyson in his own lifetime was that he reflected the fancies and sentiments of his age. The poetry of Tennyson in Memoriam A.H.H. included reflects the fancies and sentiments of Victorian England. And that is the main reason why it became so fantastic a success. The fancy that is embodied in Canto 10, that it is better to be buried in the open churchyard than to be buried in the sea, is a good example of this.